Hi, I'm Harlan Emil Gruber. Welcome to Portal to the New Earth. Today, I'm super honored to have a friend that I met at Parsons while studying in the environmental design program. For my senior year, there was a regular architectural studio, which I wasn't all that interested in. I'm more interested in things like Buckminster Fuller, Paolo Solari, and future visionary architecture. So I chose to do an independent senior thesis on future environments. And although I missed taking her class on architectural history, all of my friends who took her class were like, Jean Gardner is like the best teacher here. She's so tuned in to how we can integrate the environment into architecture. And so we met, and she became my advisor for this senior thesis on future environments, which is essentially what I'm still doing today with this work of Portal to the New Earth. So I'm so glad that Jean's able to join me today for this discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Harlan. And as I was mentioning to him a few minutes ago, having his book and making my way through it, having looked at every chapter, I am astounded at how much our interests overlap. It really is amazing because he and I haven't had a lot of exchanges. He'll pop up on my screen when he's out at Burning Man, but we haven't really talked. And to realize that starting with his thesis and choosing me and has led to what, when I open his book, is another pathway with similar overlaps. And that really is extraordinary that this would happen. I stay in contact with many, many students, and they bring such hope to me because when Harlan or I leave an impression on you, it's really pressing into our bodies. And for me, this is the key. And it's only in the last few years that I've left the world that Harlan is referring to in extraordinary detail and understanding to make my way to the subcontinent and to Pakistan. And I have no idea why I became so obsessed, but I went. And even now, I can't believe it. It took me forever to get a visa. Everything was automated, and nobody at the visa control centers in Washington or in Islamabad could control the technology once they had put it on, just like here. So somehow or other, I got my visa. I went, it was like 17 hours, changing in Dubai and ending up in Islamabad, in Pakistan. I did not speak a word of Urdu, meeting a longtime colleague and friend that I had done teaching with online. He was in Pakistan and I was in the United States. But coming there and going to his institute, the Indus Valley River Institute. Now, the Indus Valley River may not be familiar because it really, for some reason, I don't entirely understand it, was not on even the map, the radar of Pakistanis. But it reaches from the Himalayas, its source, down through Pakistan. And in the 1930s, suddenly it was discovered that there was a civilization there before the oldest civilizations that were known in that part of the world. And that opened up a significance for Pakistan that my colleague, who is an architect, but now very much a civic leader, began taking people to these ancient sites in the Indus Valley River peripheries, architectural sites. So what I want to really communicate to you is the stunning, extraordinary architecture that's in Pakistan, which dates back to when the subcontinent was one entity. The Pakistani divide from what became India happened when the Hindus sent the Muslims over a boundary, an arbitrary boundary, and then they became very oppositional. But to think of the subcontinent as a unity, and out of the Himalayas, where there are these incredible monasteries and religious sites, water flowing into the India subcontinent and flowing into Pakistan. So the Indus Valley River Institute, and actually Zen Mustafa, my colleague, my partner, my very good friend, he had already been taking people to architectural sites, and his knowledge of them has grown. And to communicate to you the significance of this, I just want to mention in Harlan's book, on page 88, he has an incredible reproduction of something called the Earth Star Grid, which is the hidden sacred body of the Earth. Well, if you look at that and take it apart, you will see that the nexus of the geometric forms are significant sites of sacred architecture around the Earth. So Stonehenge is there, Machu Picchu, the pyramids in Egypt, but people either ignored or just didn't want to pay any attention to the fact that Pakistani architecture is on that grid. So this is an incredible reproduction. So I really encourage you. It's page 88 in your book. That's the Earth Star grid, and it's the hidden sacred body of the Earth. And that's what I want to emphasize. And getting to talking about the Earth being a living organism.
Right.
Architecture can amplify the power of the Earth. That's what I was studying in Pakistan. That's what I'm interested in. Is that my colleague takes interested people to these sacred sites and has them sit on the ground so that they, before they go into the buildings, so they can start to feel the vibrations of the place.
And of course, people go to Egypt, people go to Machu Picchu knowing about this, but people don't know about the Indus River and these ancient civilizations that also have this. And like you say, this is such a significant aspect that, these ancient, civilizations understood the Earth's energy grid and worked with it. And that was a big part of it, this whole interaction. So that's super exciting. And, I'm really excited that you kick off this conversation with, this latest work that you're doing, being able to go there to Pakistan and connect with these people and study this. I'd like to just back up a little bit because I'd love to just get a little bit of your background, like how you came to be, teaching at Parsons and your interests and all that, and kind of cover some of the stuff that I knew about you back then. But first, if you just wanted to just, let us know about your teaching career and your focus in your teaching career that is integrating the environment into our built environment.
Well, when I was a graduate student at Columbia in the 1960s, a very close friend of mine was teaching the history of architecture. but he didn't have a PhD. And the university decided you can't teach the history of architecture unless you have a PhD. So they wouldn't let him continue. He was excellent. Same orientation. You have to go to the places you talk about because the earth is not visible in its energy through a photograph. So suddenly they didn't have a history teacher and they couldn't find anyone to take his place. So I became the temporary teacher of the history of architecture at Columbia. And I mean, it's still kind of amazing to me because I ended up teaching in rooms that don't even exist anymore, where I had been a graduate student with some of the giants in architectural history. Absolutely the best in Gothic, in Renaissance. And we were also terrified as graduate students to ever speak because there were these hugely important professors. So for 2 years, excuse me, I taught at Columbia, and they did finally hire somebody who was qualified, quote, had a PhD. And I went to teach at the New York School of Interior Design on the East Side. And again, I was teaching the history of architecture. The school went bankrupt and was incorporated into the New School for Social Research,
which of course Parsons is part of.
Yes, and then we became part of Parsons. And that was a huge shift because Parsons had been interior design, meaning decorating. And the first dean of this new department, he changed it to environmental design. For the graduate thesis, he brought a grubby toilet from the Bronx and said, we're interested in housing for the poor. We're not doing decorating. I mean, it was this huge shock and perfect for me. It was, was socially committed, but using architecture. So that's how I got to Parsons and the new school. Was they incorporated the New School for Interior Design. And in those early years, which, I consider you having been there and still what was the early years, the faculty was pretty much given free range to teach what we wanted. And the faculty members, I mean, it was so full of energy. And James Wines, who you interviewed.
That was great, though. He came on as the head while I was studying. But also, yes, they had free range, but for the most part, it was very much just straight up. I went there because I was interested in these, futuristic environments that Paolo Solari and Buckminster Fuller. Well, they didn't really teach him. They taught Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe, Corbusier, all the, and then of course Michael Gray's postmodernism was happening. It was all very, and so that's why I was not interested in continuing in studying what they were teaching. And I chose to work with you because you could teach what you wanted, and you knew about Bruno Taut and all this other visionary. I was interested in Glenn Small, and these are, of course, yeah. So anyway, keep going on that track, though, and that's, but it does explain where you went with all this teaching.
It was really the environmental design department quickly within Parsons became ostracized as being too free will, too intellectual, too, not cooperating with the rest of the school. We were really looked at as renegades. And that part of the history of Parsons is still really unwritten. unspoken.
Well, what it was they mixed the interior design students with architectural design students with product design students, all of it, and just called it one thing, environmental design. It doesn't exist anymore. They now have separate interior design, separate architectural departments. But at that time, it was kind of cool because it was this mishmash of anything that humans design. Let's call it environmental design.
Well, quickly over the years, those independent schools were recreated. And they
Exactly.
interior and
Yeah.
also graduate programs to go with them. And it became more and more standardized, more and more trying to be simultaneously a design school that had academic credentials, because the New School for Social Research was an academic environment. And the two things really did not mix. The students were under pressure with courses that were meant for graduate, philosophy and history students. And then they had huge studios. I mean, it was really grueling to try and fulfill those two different ways of learning. And most of the students who came to Parsons didn't come there to study intellectual history. That doesn't mean they weren't interested, but that was not why they were there.
And of course, that's what I called Parsons International Social Club. I basically had friends from all over the world. One of my best friends was from Mexico. There were people from Spain, friends from Japan, friends from Brazil. I'm still good friends with this friend who lives in Lebanon, who we got our degree together. It was international. And of course, the studio was the main part of it. And yes, in the studio, we all gravitated towards our friends, and it was essentially Parsons International Social Club more than it was this academic school. But it was great because it brought very talented people together from all over the world that we could interact and work together and learn from each other. That was the best thing about it for me, besides working with you.
Really upset me over time. The students who came from all over the world to New York City would come with this idea that somehow the culture of New York City in particular, but the United States in general, was much superior to theirs. And they would wear the clothes that they wouldn't wear at home. They'd wear the clothes. I mean, all the students dressed the same. This sense that what they knew from these ancient cultures was totally ignored. And they were put into these regimented courses where they never got an opportunity to talk about what they knew from these ancient sources. And they would often feel inferior. And if they went back home, they wouldn't fit in because their education was one in which they didn't know their own culture. It was really something that I found outrageous. So when the school went online for COVID in the spring of 2020, my colleague in Pakistan and myself decided I had a seminar that was scheduled, graduate seminar. He would bring students to it from his part of the world, and I would bring students who would sign up through the Parsons regular process. And we, from the very get-go, insisted that every student show as their background, just like you are and I am right now, where they were living and wear the clothes of their culture and focus on what was outside their door, not in what was happening in the international style or anything that Philip Johnson or Henry Russell Hitchcock, both teachers of mine when I was in college at Smith College, they wrote a narrative that ignored all the things that make this earth livable, which is diversity, and cultures that cultivate the earth in a place. and really connect with this living organism, Gaia. Actually, at one point through the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, which I lived very close to, we invited James Lovelock,
who coined the concept of Gaia, that the
yes.
earth is an entire living organism on itself. And that was a big part of what we discussed when we were doing my senior thesis. So go ahead. That's exciting that he was there.
So, New York was a place where if you kept your focus on what was happening other places, he was an atmospheric, James Lovelock, chemist, English, working for NASA and his duty or his brief was to find another planet like the Earth and, supposedly more people. So what did he do? As an atmospheric chemist, he tested the atmosphere from his laboratory in England. He didn't have to go in a spaceship. He tested the atmosphere from all the other close planets, and he came back and he said to NASA, I'm sorry, there's no reason for you to send rockets out there. The atmosphere won't sustain life. There's only one planet that sustains life. And one of the ways that it does sustain life is it actually modulates with the temperatures of the sun. Because as the sun gets hotter, it's like a cat near a fire. The earth needs to move away to survive. And that's how he came up with this, originally a hypothesis. This planet is a living organism.
And of course, Gaia is the Greek name for the goddess of earth. So he used that term Gaia to call it that, and to kind of shift this, of course, we're, very much so, academia especially is in a very materialistic science view that, every matter of the earth is not alive. Only a human or an animal is alive. So he started to propose, no, look at the way the earth is responding. It responds as it is an entire living organism in of itself.
And what you just described, unfortunately, is still continuing. Most of humanity, without knowing it, lives as if they're separate. We absolutely, without any exception, I don't care who you are, I don't care how much money you have, I don't care who your father was or your mother, you cannot survive without the air that's in this belt that includes the atmosphere, not when you get out into outer space. We couldn't breathe out there without oxygen. But the atmosphere, the air we breathe, the soil of the earth, for the food that we eat, the water, all of that sustains us. The energy from the sun comes through this belt of life. But what he talked about, still people think they are separate.
Humans there are people that disprove his theory. They go, oh, it's just this hypothesis, but it's not true. We know the earth is not alive. It's like the way you look at it. But also, I mentioned Bruno Taut, who's just a huge inspiration. And, you've studied his work and teach about it. He was this German expressionist architect that, was a key figure. I write about him in my book. And hopefully I'll do like a more in-depth explanation of his work. But one of the key principles that he proposed is that human beings are like these organisms of the earth. We're connected and we're part of the earth, and we're here to live in harmony to benefit not just humans itself, but the earth itself. We're like these cells of the earth, but we're extensions of the earth. The water, the air, the soil is how we have our bodies. And to connect to that consciousness of being connected are these ideas that are not fully embraced by modern academia, but as spiritual human beings were starting to connect and understand that more. So when there are these people that do teach it, we make inroads into how we learn and understand who we are.
Well, it's really connects to your emphasis in your book on sacred geometry, because it's not just that we need this air and this water and this soil, the earth as soil, to survive. It doesn't stop there. The penetration of that belt of life that I'm talking about, up to the top of the atmosphere and then down to the bedrock. This is why the pandemic happened. Fossil fuel maniacs drilled through the bedrock and let out all these gases that the earth was keeping sequestered so we could survive. So now the air is full of toxics and poisons. So what Lovelock was doing connects to sacred geometry. He doesn't talk about this. This is thinking that I've continued. It's through the sacred geometry, the seed of life, how the sacred geometry, that is the pathway through which the human survives. In other words, it's not random. The air, the water, the soil, all in that pathway. And the earth is answering because it's a pathway of life. And that's what that Earth star grid is showing. It's showing the geometry, and it's showing the way that the earth is penetrated by it. But what it doesn't show is the architecture. And this I really think is key to our understanding how the way we are building, it's not just the way we're thinking. We think we're separate from nature, but the way we build is also killing the planet. So we have this double, we're smothering her. That the architecture in Pakistan, what I experienced, what I learned about, my colleague there, Zen Mustafa, and I did a whole series of live chats. I would be in New York and he'd be in Karachi, where he lived at that time. And they're all on YouTube, where we would, go back and forth discussing what was happening in these two dimensions. And we finally came to the point where I realized I've got to go there. It's one thing for us to talk about it. We taught together, as I mentioned, but for me to go. And everyone thought I was crazy. My son-in-law, practically forbid me from going because he was afraid he was going to have to go and, bring me back. I mean, Pakistan was considered this terrorist country, just like the hinterland. But somehow I got it in my mind. I got through a horrible rigmarole of getting a visa and a 17-hour plane ride, landing in Qatar, in Dubai, changing planes. I don't even know how I made it from one plane to the other. I mean, when I think back on it, I think I was somehow guided. And then landing in Islamabad in the middle of the night. And there was then Mustafa to meet me. So it was pitch dark, and his driver. And I have to say, from the minute I got off the plane, even at dark at night, seeing on the highways these amazing trucks that were all hand painted. I mean, unbelievable. It was a whole tradition in Pakistan. The smells, the people, the sounds, every single thing was different. Now, I've traveled extensively in Europe, been to Greece, been to Finhorn in Scotland. I've traveled all throughout the United States. I've been on the reservations of the tribal people in the United States and the Southwest. Nothing was familiar. I mean, it was total realization that we don't have a clue about what the earth and its relationship to people who cultivate the earth, that becomes their culture, or have an architecture, an ancient architecture. In fact, you'll enjoy this. I actually met Zen when he came to Parsons for a year or so, and absolutely, it was in 1991, he absolutely refused to take any undergraduate courses, although he wasn't a graduate student. And so he made his way somehow into a graduate seminar, very small, very special. We sat in a circle, and I was talking about the ancient architecture of the Southwest, the Hopis, who I have spent time on their reservation, and how, you know, they were the oldest living community on the North American continent. And he's sitting there and he says, well, you know, in Pakistan, we have architecture that's 7,000 years old. I was like, I have never forgotten it. It was like it just went and hit me in my body. And I'm sure that was the magnet from 1991 till I went there, and I don't know what it was, last fall for 3 months, against all odds, you know, having practically over my son-in-law's body to go because he thought it was going to be so dangerous. My daughter, who's an architect, struck up a back and forth with Zen to sort of reassure herself that I was all right. He would send her reports of where we were going and pictures of what we were doing. And, you know, pretty soon they both discovered they were architects, and they weren't interested in me at all. Talking about the buildings. It was fabulous.
What was your biggest takeaway from spending those 3 months there? I mean, you've already said how it's just this other world and it goes back ancient. And like you said, it's one thing to learn about these. It's another thing to actually be physically on the land and to be feeling it. It might not even be able to put it into words because it's more about this experience. But, you know, to share what it is that you took away that, you know, can actually relates to like where we are right now in, you know, moving ahead with how we are inhabiting the planet in the more conscious way, and what you learned and got from being there.
Well, this basic principle that Zen applies, he takes people to these ancient sites, but he also does it. He moved out of Karachi, out of the urban environment, to a small community outside of Islamabad. So Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, is the nearest big city. But he moved as an urban person to a farm that he is cultivating. So what did I take away? How important it is to feel the earth. Now, this is what Central Park can do, and Olmsted knew when he incorporated the earth. I'm not interested in, you know, I am interested, but not in the way I'm talking. Union Square Park is a potted plant over the subway. Yes, giant trees grow there. It's fabulous as a place to go and have a class, but the living earth inside of a city.
I would love Central Park. It's pretty magical what he did. Creates a magical little pocket. There's one corner that's completely kept as wilderness that you can't go into. And I would go and be like, I want to go in there. Just, it's like a bird sanctuary. And then, of course, all the way at the northern tip is the cloisters and what's the park called that's kind of been left to go wild
Yes,
up
so
there.
that is the part that I actually worked with a um,
What's it,
Mark.
Inwood? What's it called? That's the neighborhood. But what's the name of the park? The Cloisters, which is this amazing
Oh,
building that
it's
they
the northern part of Central.
Manhattan.
That's
No,
the
it's
northern part, and
no
it's
Manhattan. No, it's the tip of Manhattan, all the way up north.
all the way up Inwood Hill Park.
Yeah, Inwood Hill, which is pretty left to go wild. You go
Yes,
there and you could see remnants of old sidewalks, and now it's a forest. Which I want to just segue because you wrote this incredible book in the mid '80s, Urban Wilderness, and you documented all of the wilderness lands in New York City. When you think of New York City, you just think of this sprawling metropolis with millions of people, and every square inch of it should be paved over. But no, New York City has huge amounts of wetlands, which you really can't or shouldn't pave over. And what you pointed to, though, was that the history of New York, the reason why New York City is arguably the greatest city, or at least one of the greatest cities on the planet, has so many people, is because originally it was such an incredibly lush wildlife with so much wetlands to support a huge amount of life. And of course, little by little, it all got turned into a city, but there still are all these pockets of incredibly rich wetlands. And now there is a project in New York City to bring the oysters back. It's called like the
yes,
Billion Oyster
yes,
Project.
yes.
But you went out and you documented every little bit of New York City in this incredible book, Urban Wilderness, to show that even in such a huge metropolis, there still is wilderness. And what wilderness really means, and of course, is that humans don't have access to it.
Central Park is not designed over a vibratory field. Next, what I call a nexus, which you see on that grid on page 88 in your book. So going to these sites in Pakistan where you sit on the earth and you can feel the vibrations, that then the architecture amplifies it. So when you go inside, you are feeling the earth shaped into architecture. And that's what we call sacred architecture. That's the pyramids in Egypt, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu. There are a number of these sites around the world. So that you don't get in Central Park. You do get the earth, the living earth, but you don't get this crossing of important vibrational pathways. And that's where these buildings, that is what makes them sacred. And then the architecture, this ancient architecture in Pakistan, in the Indus Valley, amplifies it. So when you go inside, first you're sitting on the ground feeling it, and then when you're inside, it enters your body and you feel it. So this is the magic of what it means to build, like you talk about. You imagine the earth. I have a quote here where humans act in coherence to the grid energies of the earth. Well, this is where the architecture, and there are sites, as I said, all around the earth. I mean, Machu Picchu, I did a whole study on that. The water system is still working. There are still people who know where the springs are, but the scholars go and act like, it's a dead place, but the water is still moving through. It's just so important for us to realize that what you're focusing on with your portal, what Zen Mustafa in Pakistan is focusing on, is what keeps the earth alive. Now, what's really extraordinary is what I learned about Islamic architecture, because that's what we're talking about. It's much more complicated than the sacred geometry of buildings in the Western world. It's unbelievably different. so much more sophisticated. And it goes down to, the mosques with their rugs and the carvings, and where the relationship was between a conquering group and the local craftsmen. Sorry, I'm the one that's getting.
Right. I know the natural, people building, with their heart and spirit in it. And, there's a comment I want to make, because you were talking about how people would show up with their indigenous clothing and in their place to represent it. But obviously, in the architectural world, we see modern architecture of the big glass and concrete skyscrapers that have been built in every major city in every part of the world, that makes it completely homogenous now. And we're losing that indigenous, locality. And you could, there's that funny movie from the 60s or 70s called Playtime, where people travel all around to different, countries and stuff, but it's the exact same looking buildings, and they're building everywhere that, are reducing it, in the same businesses, the same stores. Anywhere you go, anywhere in the world, and there's going to be a Starbucks or a McDonald's to eat at, no matter what country you're in now. And this weird homogeneity that's, heartless and has no spirit or soul, rather than, each indigenous people embodying what they do and putting that into where they live, and that variety that could take place. And just to imagine the world, to try to move away from what's already been put in place right now, this modern soulless way of living on the planet, and to be able to reconnect back to the Earth's energy grid, to incorporate that into our buildings. And it's so important to be able to go to these places like you did, to actually experience it and see it, to understand it firsthand, what is possible.
Well, you hit the very key to continuing that tradition. So Zen Mustafa, educated in an English boarding school, went to Parsons for a while, then went to Dubai, and then went home and discovered this incredible tradition, which is maintained locally by indigenous groups. And he honors them when he takes us there, which largely is other Pakistanis. When he takes people there, he has somebody local telling you about the history, possibly guiding you. So this idea of indigenous that you hit on is absolutely key. The way we treat indigenous, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, putting these native people, like I have gotten connected here in the Delaware River Valley to the Lenape, which are the tribal group, the indigenous group that for years, centuries, the English acted like they didn't exist except when they arrived. But the reality is they were driven west and put on a reservation. Well, now they're coming back, and they're coming to meetings and very politely saying, you can't build there. That's a sacred place. And right down the road from where I am, fed by a spring in the back here, the little tributary goes into the sacred spring of the Lenape. But it's all been, parking lots around it. It's just this little tiny, I know, it's heartbreaking. So it's exactly what you're talking about. We are covering over what it is that gives us life in the name of speed, automobiles.
Well, and the thing is, it was done with people unconsciously. It's kind of, that's what, the reason why I build my portal installations isn't because I'm interested in building portals and being known as making these sculptures. It's to facilitate this shift of consciousness. And it's a tool that I see that I can put out there for people. But once the consciousness is shifted, then the people who did pave that, they wouldn't do that. They would say, like, no, this is a sacred spring. Let's treat it as such. And just all the way, every choice we make in how we build and inhabit the earth would shift because of the consciousness. And right now, we're still in this very materialistic, scientific, separate worldview, which is why we have the architecture and the way that we're building. And yet, what my book is proposing and what, you've been connected to your whole life is these understandings that connecting to the earth and building in accordance with it and embodying these energies into our architecture is so important. And it existed historically, and now we're reconnecting and learning about it and seeing it, experiencing it.
Well, the key thing is that we also know that the earth is evolving. And one of the things that James Lovelock, the atmospheric chemist that we were talking about, who developed the Gaia hypothesis that the earth was a living organism, at the end of his life, he horrified people by saying that the earth is evolving and it's going to evolve out of our ability to sustain life as we know it. And people were shocked. They thought he had somehow, gone crazy. But what he had begun to understand and now is pretty much accredited, the earth is moving and evolving. We aren't the end of the evolution.
No, and you just said life as we know it. And as we know it right now, doesn't a lot of us, what we know is not the best anyway. So it could be a good thing to evolve. And I William Irwin Thompson, I got to see him speak around the same time I was studying and doing my thesis. And he's this cultural historian. And he's like, I want to study the origins of human culture. He goes, well, I can't stop at humans. I got to go all the way back to the very first origin of life on the earth, which were anaerobic bacteria that lived there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. And these anaerobic bacteria gave off oxygen as their waste product until the whole atmosphere became toxified for them with oxygen. But all life as we know it now relies on oxygen. And so they have to live underground where there's no air. They still exist. There's still anaerobic bacteria, but now all plants and animals, especially animals, rely on oxygen, the waste product. So then he proposed, well, humans are now toxifying the earth with, radioactivity and all these other toxins that may become the food or what is necessary for the next form of life. Like life itself doesn't care. Life keeps going on. And this evolution that's taking place may be to a shift that's very different than our current human civilization. But that doesn't mean the end of life. It just means as we know it, what we've done. And we've kind of explored that pretty well. And we are kind of ready for a major shift of living, what I propose as the new earth. One more thing I want to jump back to is our mutual interest in Hopi land. So as soon as I got out of Parsons, I did a road trip and didn't know where I wanted to live or what I wanted to do. And I lived in a van for 9 months traveling around the U.S., and I spent a lot of time on Hopi land. I would just drive down these roads there, which you're not supposed to do. You're supposed to just go to the cultural center and go camping out. And then some Hopi Indians would come along like, hey, what are you doing here? And I'm like, oh, I'm just, I love it here. And they're like, oh, wow, cool. Hey, let me show you where the spring is. Or we got to show you this ghost line that when the Navajo were relocated and we had to keep them out of our land. And I made friends with the Hopi, and the Hopi are acknowledged to have been living continuously on those mesas for at least 1,000 years. They are continuously inhabited villages in North America for at least 1,000 years. Now, I lived in Taos, New Mexico for a while, and it's acknowledged that the Taos Pueblo there has been continuously inhabited for 800 years. So they're close with the Hopi, and the Hopi will say, well, we've been here longer. But you know how academics don't want to give too much credence to that kind of stuff. But the Hopi also have in their story that they traveled to the four corners of the continent. It was part of their mission in emerging into the fourth world that they're in. And then they finally settled in the center, which is Hopi land, which is completely inhospitable, uninhabitable land. It's the driest, most remote, crazy, desert mesas that nobody but nobody would ever want to go live in. But they were guided there spiritually to be there. And through their connection to nature, they were able to bring enough rain to grow their crops, and they could live there and subsist in this extremely harsh environment. Now, when the white people came and settled Turtle Island, North America, USA, they moved all the Indians, like from Pennsylvania. We know about the Cherokee that lived in the most beautiful Smoky Mountains, and they put them all into lands that were not so great, like Oklahoma. But even the Navajo were living in all these great places. They were kind of nomadic to begin with. We're like, no, we stuck them all out in that desert surrounding the Hopi, like completely inhospitable. We made the reservations. But the Hopi, we didn't have to move them. They were already living on land that we could care less about, and we just made that reservation right there for them, and that's your reservation. And they did build newer towns that with our newer American style living and stuff, and it's not the greatest situation there, but the Hopi did forbid any commercial development. So when you do go to Hopi land, you're like in another planet, another world for the most part, especially back in the 80s when they went there. It was really still this 1,000-year-old villages and living pretty simply. I mean, of course, they had paved a road through there so you could drive there and not have to hike like they did for eons before there was modern transportation. But the energy, the Hopi are like the holders of the prophecy. And I was really attracted to being there and connecting to that energy and being able to spend time on that land, to feel what it is like to be there on this sacred, powerful earth energy spot.
Wait till you hear my story.
Good. So go ahead. I went on too long telling our connection, but
1950s, I went to work on a ranch in Arizona that was owned by a woman. It never even occurred to me how unusual that was. There were about maybe 6 or 7 teenage girls. And we were taught to lasso the cows and brand them and go bear hunting. We did everything that the cowboys did. And the woman who owned the ranch was an honorary member of the Hopi Nation. So she and us, the few girls working for her, were invited to come to the snake dances. So we went to we camped on the desert below Walpay, and we saw the young braves running up the mesa with the living snakes. We went up on the mesa itself and watched the ceremonies. They weren't open to the public. And I had some amazing experiences. I'll give you the link to them. They're on my Group Global site. It was totally transformative. The incredible thing was that one night we were sleeping. We slept on these cots on the desert because there were snakes. And we were woken up and we went in a pickup truck to what I realize now was a hogan on the Navajo reservation. And there was a blessing ceremony going on. Somebody was sick. So we went and sat in the back and watched the shaman with the sick person doing the whole ceremony, sitting in the midst of the Navajo. I remember there was a woman in front of me who had very long earlobes. And I found out later that that's considered a sign of sacredness, that older person. But it has stayed in my mind, the young braves, the young Indians running up the mesa with these rattlesnakes twisted around their neck, in their hands, and not being bitten. It was absolutely, I'll send you the link to the story.
Wow. And I'm sure, like you said, it was a transformative experience to be able to, when you're on that land and you're connecting, like you were invited into their sacred ceremonies. And I remember on that same trip, spending a good amount of time out there, there was this one ceremony that they would allow the public into the kiva. And it was in the winter. and it gets cold out there, and they made us wait till like 2 in the morning, and I remember it was even like snowing a little, and we're freezing and waiting and waiting and waiting, and it was kind of like a test. They're not just going to let anyone just drive up and, hey, come in our kiva and see our dance. And finally they're like, come in, and they let us all sit on one side, and then they come and they're just doing this repetitive dance, chanting and dancing and rattling. But that's something that doesn't happen anymore at all. That
Oh,
I was able to go through that ordeal to be able to connect and experience something like that was really, really phenomenal. And and I'm drawn to it. I just feel this connection to it. And I remember having certain dreams while sleeping on the land that were interesting, and connecting to it. And it's right here. It's part of the United States, but it's not. You go to Hopi land, you are not both legally in the United States, but more than that, it's really, they hold this energy and this vibration and frequency that you can experience directly.
well, I think you'll be very interested to know that now, having looked at their traditional, not myself, but people who are interested in this, looked at their traditional garb, the 16 days they spend in the kiva, and they have traced the history back to their crossing over the straits and into the subcontinent, that they are actually carrying traditions into what we call Turtle Island that originated back there. So it connects exactly to what I was talking about earlier, the ancient origins of these matrilineal civilizations. The Hopis were matrilineal, so were the Indus Valley civilization. And it's just, it's not only, the other thing I want to mention, and be sure that we both get across to people listening, is these things do not exist in the past. The fact that you and I are talking about it, that you went to the Hopi sites, that I went to the ones in Pakistan, we are bringing these into the present. Our bodies are vibrationally changed. And it's not, oh, it happened then, that's ancient history. And isn't it fun to go and sit on the ground and feel these things? Our bodies are changed. And you have a whole chapter about sound, and that's vibration. And so the vibrations that you're bringing through the portal work, I'm bringing through continuing to talk about Pakistan, getting people to listen to the reality of this ancient land, even though it's being flooded, 2/3 of it were flooded from climate change that the United States and China are responsible for. I mean, it's not a localized situation anymore. We have to realize how important it is, the work you're doing, the work I'm doing, to change the vibrations in this upward spiral as the rest of civilization goes down, the Kali Yuga. So that.
Yeah, no, I think also talking about the Hopi is a good thing. We should probably segue just into the fact that all of North America was completely inhabited by many more Native Americans than we academically acknowledge, or they're starting to. And when I was in the design science studio, when people would introduce themselves, a lot of times they would say what native land they're from, and trying to acknowledge and recognize. And of course, in Australia, that's happening in a big way too, that all of these Western civilizations that have taken over lands that were originally inhabited by the native people, that we are, giving a lot more rights and a lot more understanding and connecting to them, and wanting to incorporate that into how we inhabit the land. And so, like you were just talking about, you're in Pennsylvania now, and how of course, Pennsylvania was 100% cleaned out. It's like, this is too good a place for us white people. All you Native Americans, we're going to put you on some reservations, who knows where, Oklahoma or somewhere else. But they're still around, the tribes that were there, and they're coming back, and they're teaching about the sacred sites. And Cahokia Mounds in this right there outside of St. Louis. Largest mound work, largest mound. The largest mound is bigger than the Great Pyramid in its size at the base, not in its height, but it was a city, a civilization that academically is acknowledged to have been bigger than all the cities in Europe at that time, 1200 years ago or 1200 AD. I forget exactly, but it was a huge civilization. North America is covered with these mounds, not just Serpent Mound. There are signs of civilization going back thousands and thousands of years. There are megalithic stone structures in North America that don't like to be acknowledged. There's a place in Montana with that. This woman has a website, Montana Megaliths. Humans have been here living in this sacred, harmonious indigenous way, and yet whatever happened that we've now settled it with the Western in the last few hundred years and created the civilization that we have right now is just kind of like a segue or temporary thing. And we're starting to acknowledge, connect, and learn. I've always, my whole life, have felt more connected to Native American spiritual teachings than any, religious teachings that I've been brought up with. And I've learned and I've connected with various Native American spiritual teachings that I take part in. And so, yeah, you go and talk a little bit more about that and how that can influence what we are doing.
You'll be
Yep.
not surprised when I was born near those pyramids that you're talking about. I've been there. That's where I come from. So that's my native soil. When I was little, they were covered with grass and then they were uncovered. And I went and saw them. And then in Ohio, I lived not very far away from the snake mounds that you can only really see if you levitate and look down because it's so huge. And, again, a testimony to the extraordinary response to the earth that's different. Each place we have any remnant of the way the indigenous people responded. And then just what you were describing, all the standardization, the malls, all the highways from the airports lined with the same trees, the total lack of understanding of the absolute beauty of this continent and the importance of these indigenous people that are left, that have the memories. Now, this for me is a very difficult situation because I'm not indigenous just because I was, born near those mounds. I'm not I don't have a lineage going back. And, being a white Caucasian, I don't want to just sort of pop up and say, oh, I really sympathize with you, Lenape, or I really sympathize with you, Hopi. In the case of the Hopis, because the woman who owned the ranch was an honorary member, we were treated differently. But in general, I think it's a very important dilemma for us, you, I, to, you're building this portal. I feel absolutely responsible in the sense of responding to what I experienced in Pakistan because I'm not indigenous. I'm not Pakistani. So honing my destiny in relationship to not claiming that I in any way know what the Lenape are doing and how to support them without just looking like a fortunate, I'm very fortunate. Look at me.
Privileged white.
Yeah. And also female. So I think this is a challenge for both of us.
But don't you get a sense, though, like you said, that was your native land? And I grew up on Long Island. And as a teenager growing up there, I kind of felt the spirit of the land and the spirit of the Native American people living there that was like infused in the land. Like I could sort of tap into that and sense it and feel it, that we are of the land of where we grew up, and that the natives lived there for a long time. And there's a certain energy that even if you have no native blood at all, just the fact that that's where you lived on this land, and the land has a certain spirit and energy, and the natives connected with that spirit, that it kind of transfers that way.
Well, again, I think it's a very, that is like now I'm not in Illinois. I'm here in Pennsylvania. And actually I did discover that my family and my son-in-law's family too were Quakers that came to Philadelphia before William Penn. So I do have those roots, but it's still a colonizing route. And so, I mean, for me, it's my challenge right now in terms of continuing the story, using the recognition that I have, the opportunities I have, like this podcast, to further this reclaiming of the earth through architecture, through indigenous voices, and, not be taking that away and somehow using my privileged position. What I experienced in all of what we're talking about is the importance of what I call embodied experience. You have to be where you're talking about, and you have to listen to your body, to the wisdom of your body, to the feelings that are coming up, not a theory taken from a class or from anybody else. We have to believe in ourselves, this embodiment. So my website and my nonprofit earthgroupglobal.org is dedicated to that. Everything, every page, every aspect of the site deals with embodiment and how you become embodied. And I'm going to invite you, Harlan, to write something for the blog page, which is where people write about transformative experiences that they've embodied. And it's got people from all over the world. It's grown into something I never imagined. That's where I talk about my experience at the Hopis. So I think that's where we should
Yeah,
end.
that's great. Of course, the link to earthgroupglobal.org will be in the description, but if you just want to listen to it, it's just spelled one word, earthgroupglobal.org is the website. So that's really wonderful that, you're using your time and abilities to help benefit the world through that, which is really good. It's a great website. I've checked it out. There's a lot of good resources and connections made through that. And this has just been such a great conversation. So thank you so much for joining me today. And so, of course, everyone listening to this, be sure to hit like and to share and subscribe to the channel. That's the way we can get this out there to more people, that this will help benefit, everyone on the planet to create this new Earth. So thank you again, Jean. It's been so great to catch up with you. And, of course, we'll probably have you back on some future date, because it's a great conversation that we have. We have so much to share and so much connection.
Yes, so much more to say. So thank you, Harlan. Thank you so much.